way for everybody to gather around the table. I'm very happy to moderate today this very important side event with regard to gender and disability, and making it be included as a subject, in our debates. And I want to first of all recognize the presence of the Ambassador of Australia here, thank you, John, for being with us, and of course all the participants. So let me start by thanking International Disability Alliance and Handicap International for organizing this event on advancing gender equity for women and girls with disabilities. So the purpose is to increase accessibility to persons with disabilities. The idea is that the meeting is going to have international sign interpretation and captioning. That's what I wanted to say. And the event is being webcast live. So thank you very much to the interpreter. And this event will count with participation of speakers here who are present in the room, but also at a distance, who will be speaking to us through video. We have messages that have been recorded by some of the speakers that were not here. And what we mark today is the launching of a very important report by Handicap International, Making It Work Initiative on Gender and Disability Inclusion, which I believe is still being printed, being finalized. Yes, that's what's happening. So that's why I suppose we all have this format. And this report focuses on violence against women and girls with disabilities, of course, very timely in terms of the SDGs and the agenda for 2030 on sustainable development. I don't want to bore us with numbers, but I think it's always important to be able to, picture the fact that worldwide there are more than 1 billion women and girls with disabilities. That's a very big figure. And the vast majority lives in poor countries. Women and girls with disabilities face multiple forms of discrimination based on their disability, on their gender, and many other factors. And because of that, in part, their issues, specific issues, especially the issue of being of suffering some kind of a disability, remains often invisible. Poverty, of course, is compounded by the lack of access to education and health services, exposes women and girls with disabilities to greater vulnerabilities to violence, abuse, and exploitation. So the report gives us, and we'll hear more about it, concrete guidance on how to ensure inclusive responses to violence. It tries to be very concrete and very practical. That's the intention of this report. Violence against women and girls with and without disabilities. The unique angle of these good practices that are reflected here in this report, which is based on the Making It Work methodology, of which we'll hear a bit more also, focuses on what works rather than what does not work to improve the prevention and the response to gender-based violence against women and girls with disabilities. So today's conversation is to try to give us the opportunity to exchange on this issue and learn how responses to violence against women and girls can be more inclusive and accessible to women and girls with disability. So we have a long list of speakers who I hope are going to be brief and to the point, because at the same time we're supposed to finish by 2:45. And our first speaker is Diane Kingston, Vice Chair of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. She will be on video, providing us a video message. So, shall we?
So first of all, I'd like to actually a bit about COPD itself and the work that we're doing on women and girls with disabilities. So crucially, of course, in our jurisprudence, we talk about specifics of girls with disabilities. And most recently, we've been developing a general comment on women and girls with disabilities. That general comment covers three key areas.
And
the first of which
those are the
is the intersection or the multiple discrimination of women and girls with disabilities.
Yeah.
I can give you two key examples of areas which specifically refer to women and girls with disabilities. The first being, of course, accessible breastfeeding areas in places of work. Of course, having a breastfeeding area in a place of work is good for a woman with or without disability. But if that place is inaccessible, then a woman with disability cannot access that place. Another area could be, for example, the menstrual management of girls in schools with disabilities. So those girls have a higher dropout rate if they cannot access sanitation facilities within a school environment. The other two key areas that we're focusing on, but not exclusively, are violence against women, all forms of violence, exploitation and abuse. And the third area is sexual and reproductive rights and the rights of the family. And of course this is very pertinent to women and girls with disabilities in terms of forced or coerced sterilisation, abortion, contraception, and the right to found a family. This, of course, intersects with our Article 12 and our first general comment on legal capacity, especially as it relates to women and girls with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities. So I'd like to thank the CEDAW Committee very much indeed for your input into our general comment, and we would very much welcome any further information that you have as we finalising our general comment for hopefully public reading in our multiple session. Now, in terms of what you're doing, CEDAW Committee, on women and girls with disabilities, I have a few key messages that I would like to give you. The first of which is to really mainstream women with disabilities into the work of your committee. So actually name us, women and girls with disabilities. I would also very much like for you to refer to our specific rights, rather than generally, rather than refer to us as a group of other women who are marginalised or vulnerable. Actually naming us will go a long way in terms of redress agreements. The second is actually in terms of healthcare or education, for example, to talk about accessible healthcare, to talk about accessible, inclusive education. And in order to make it pertinent and real for the lives of women and girls with disabilities, to talk about accessibility not just in terms of the built environment, but to talk in terms of information and communication as well. So to talk specifically for sign language interpreters for deaf women and girls, to talk about easy-to-read formats for people with intellectual disabilities, and to talk about braille and large print for people with vision as well. Another area is that of data and statistics and the invisibility of women with disabilities. I would very much welcome you to recommend to state committees in your concluding observations that they collect data, disaggregated data, specifically on women and girls with disabilities. And my final point is really to ask you very kindly if you would cross-reference the work of our committee, our jurisprudence, in your own concluding observations and further general recommendations or general comments. To talk about the work
Well, thank you very much to Diane. Very concise and very specific and concrete recommendations to CEDAW. Let me just say, maybe we should immediately hear Harumi Fuentes, who also is from the committee. She's from the Secretariat of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Harumi, there you are. If you want to expand on Beatrice's speech.
Thank you very much. My name is Carmen Fuentes. I work with the Secretariat of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'm speaking on behalf of Jorge Araya, who was unable to come. Some of the CEDAW experts know me because I also work for the Secretariat of CEDAW. And today I'd like to expand a bit more on OHCHR's work on the rights of women and girls with disabilities and how this relates to violence against women and girls with disabilities. So OHCHR works under the very broad framework of equality and countering discrimination. And under this framework, it is that we work to combat discrimination against girls and women with disabilities. And among the initiatives I'd like to share with you today is a report on judicial stereotyping and how it affects also women and girls with disabilities. So I've brought this table. It's one of the findings from the report. And the part that is highlighted in yellow is an example of compounded stereotypes affecting women with disabilities. You can see that stereotyping leads to very negative outcomes for women with disabilities, in particular in the case of mental impairments, women who may be denied access to justice and also a fair trial because, especially in cases of gender-based violence, because of stereotypes, harmful stereotypes perpetuated by judges and prosecutors. So as you can see from the table, there's a stereotype that, a woman with a mental disability could not have been assaulted because she must have consented to sex, where she may require more corroborating evidence than in cases involving a woman without such a disability. So we really want to thank the CEDAW experts because it is thanks to many of the submissions that were received for your half-day general discussion on access to justice and also for the general recommendation on access to justice. The office was able to use these submissions to come up with this report. So thank you for this. And before the report on judicial stereotyping, there was another report commissioned by the office on gender stereotyping as a human rights violation. The report highlighted the fact that women with disabilities were at a high risk of violence based precisely on the social stereotypes that dehumanize, infantilize, exclude, or isolate them. So the office really prioritizes the issue of gender stereotyping throughout its work, and we're especially happy to assist all the special procedures mandate holders and also the treaty body experts, you specifically CEDAW, to address stereotyping and the effect that it can have on the human rights of women and girls with disabilities. Two older reports that you might be aware of concerning women and girls with disabilities and violence are the thematic reports for the Human Rights Council in 2012 and the report by the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women on the same topic, which wanted to delve more deeply into the thematic study. Now, the specific situation of women and girls with disabilities is integrated into the work of the office. For example, concerning sexual and reproductive health and rights, throughout the field presences, the office promotes the autonomy and the self-determination of women with disabilities and the elimination of discrimination against them in the provision of health and, in particular, sexual and reproductive health services. Also, we carry out a lot of awareness-raising initiatives so that national laws, policies, and programs comply with the international human rights standards. And we continue to carry out concrete interventions throughout the field presences, and lately Guatemala, Moldova, West Africa, with different partners, the media, with the judiciary, and also with grassroots communities and organizations of persons with disabilities in order to really address the issue of stereotyping and of the human rights of women and girls with disabilities. As Diane Kingston mentioned, also the committee is in the process of drafting the general comment on women and girls with disabilities. So for this, the office and WHO organized an interagency meeting with UN Women, who is here present too, UN Women, UNFPA, UNICEF, WHO, and OHCHR organized a 2-day meeting to really work on how to best take advantage of the synergies that are coming out of the work on this topic. We're also very well placed to provide technical assistance, and this is part of the mandate of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And, well, lastly, I would like to reiterate our continued support to states parties to the Convention, to civil organizations, and also, of course, to the treaty body experts. And I want to congratulate the Making It Work Global Initiative on Gender and Disability Inclusion, Handicap International, and the International Disability Alliance for today's launch of the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harumi. A couple of comments at this point. I want to make sure that we make it flow. Number one, with regard to the suggestions by Beatrice to CEDAW, of course I will let Patricia Schulz in her concluding remarks, or before if you wish, to address them. But I presume, and being myself a former member of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, I presume that the same recommendations also apply to a committee such as the Committee on the Rights of the Child, who looks at the girl from that angle. So I would suggest that maybe we need to ensure that that is happening. And I know as a fact that the CRC actually does pay a lot of attention at the issue of boys and girls, in this case, with disabilities. And then what was mentioned by Harumi, very interesting, the emphasis that the Office of the High Commissioner is putting on studying better and understanding better stereotyping as a basis for violence and discrimination. And I wonder whether the next speakers can address that from the point of view of best practices. How, in fact, can you reflect, in the method, not only the methodology, but the report itself that is being launched, and in the best practices, good examples to combat stereotyping, in fact. And of course, synergies, again, is a big issue, again, cutting across some of the treaty bodies. I think it's important, and the special procedures. So let me then move to Priscilla Geyser, representing Handicap International and the International Disability and Development Consortium, and Lisa Adams following, who is a member of the Global Making It Work Technical Advisory Committee, and they will refer more to the report itself. So please, Priscilla, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here to support the launch of this very important publication. We really want to take this opportunity to make a strong pledge on advancing equity for women and girls with disability today. So I'm going to reflect a little bit on the Making It Work methodology that was used for this report. And I think my colleague Lisa will talk a little bit more on how it was applied with the Technical Advisory Committee that supported this initiative. So about 10 years ago, when the CRPD was adopted, a lot of the stakeholders were wondering how we could move into implementation in practice of this very important convention. And that's in this context that Handicap International started the Making It Work initiative with the intention to draw from existing examples of what was successful, examples of concrete practices advancing the rights of people with disabilities, and use this to stimulate more positive change for social inclusion. So what is important to understand from the Making It Work methodology is that it really tries to start practical, drawing from good practices as a way to learn from what already exists, what has been proven successful, and use that for replication or inspiration, trying to analyze through a concrete example what is the process for change, how it works, and how it can be replicated. Another key element is that we didn't want these good practices to just be in a report that sits on a shelf, but really embed as part of the initiative the use of the good practices and recommendations for advocacy. So part of Making It Work is really using the evidence of good practices for advocacy and actions for change. trying to scale up or to replicate, as I said, and using a solution-focused sort of advocacy, not only denunciating what goes wrong, but also providing concrete solutions. But one very key point that I would like to stress is the very collaborative nature of making it work. It's not something that we wanted to conduct in isolation, and I think one of the great values of the methodology lies in the multi-stakeholder engagement. So the point with making it work is that from the very beginning to develop alliances across different sectors. So in this particular case, trying to join the disability sector and the gender sector to give more value to the good practices because they are commented from different angles with different viewpoints, and we think this can add also to the legitimacy of what is being presented as good. It's also important because it provides an opportunity to, as was asked before, to overcome the stigma by working together and trying to address a common issue with a unified voice. So as of now, the Making It Work methodology has been used to identify and collect over 200 good practices in 50 countries with involvement of about 60 different organizations. But in 2013, HI decided to put a specific emphasis on trying to test the methodology at a global level, and focusing on an issue that is not very spoken about, which is the issue of violence and abuse against women and girls with disabilities. So one of the key learning points from this phase was that on such an issue, joining hands and bringing together women with disabilities who have been identified as good practice holders, so to speak, was a way to break their isolation. Because this is a very difficult issue to work with, and usually there are limited opportunities to exchange on what works, on what are the challenges at country level. Another key learning for this phase was the very strong added value of the presence of a technical advisory committee at the global level, who provided strong recommendations drawing from the examples of these 10 good practices and producing some key points that were used for advocacy at different levels. For example, at the Conference on the Status of Women, but also making recommendations on, for the general comment on Article 6 of the CRPD on women with disabilities. Also trying to link a little bit more with gender advisors within UN agencies. Finally, on this phase, what was also very interesting and not fully intended at the very beginning is how working together and having these women with disabilities and women engaged in fighting violence against women coming together to work on those good practices, it created some space for a new form of alliance and exchange. Starting some sort of networking, but with a purpose. You know, sometimes there are lots of networks that are started. This one was created as a result of common interests and with a will to engage more in action together. So now, I think in terms of the way forward, we are very aware that the good practices that are in this report, 11 good practices are just a start. We need more. It's not enough. There are areas of the world that are not yet covered, in particular Asia. We want, of course, to continue advocacy, mobilizing gender actors to work together, in particular to support the enforcement of Goal 5 of the SDGs so that it benefits also to women and girls with disabilities. And in that perspective, I believe that Making It Work can serve as a bridge because of this collaborative nature and trying to foster linkages between actors that maybe do not work together in normal times. So in this context where we have to advance the implementation of different human rights treaties and also implement the SDGs with the pledge of leaving no one behind. I think it's really critical that we come together, that the gender movement, the disability movement work hand in hand, not to duplicate, but to have a stronger voice. For this, HI is willing to expand the use of the Making It Work methodology. And I'm also very happy to share that last week, when we had the board of the IDDC, which is a network of 28 disability and development organizations, for the first time, we stimulated more discussion and agreed to coordinate more on our actions around gender and disability. So I really think this initiative has long to live, and I really want to encourage for more alliances between gender and disability stakeholders to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. Indeed, as you were saying, what is captured in the report in terms of good practices mostly covers Latin America and Africa to a certain extent, but clearly there is much more that needs to be done to expand the work to other regions. Let me ask Lisa Adams, as a member of the Global Making It Work Technical Advisory Committee, to also address us on the topic of the report. Please go ahead, Lisa.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I have a big job today because I'm representing the Technical Advisory Committee. So I'm very happy to be here with all of you. I wanted to just start the discussion by explaining a little bit about the advisory committee and how we came together to decide to focus this report on the issue of violence. So we were a group of different gender and disability experts from different parts of the world, and part of the initiative was to allow for this kind of a collaborative approach in which the committee itself was defining what kinds of good practices we were going to look at, what kinds of advocacy we were going to do, and what the focus area was going to be. And at our very first meeting, we highlighted, when looking at gender and disability, we highlighted violence as a major issue and one that wasn't getting enough attention. So I'm going to just speak briefly about the unique issues related to violence, abuse and exploitation of women and girls with disabilities, to get a bit of a context about why we chose this topic. We all know that women experience high rates of violence. Women with disabilities and girls with disabilities, because of the conflation between different forms of discrimination based on gender, disability, and other identity markers, experience higher rates of violence. In fact, women with disabilities are 2 to 3 times more likely to be victims of physical and sexual abuse than non-disabled women. The forms of violence range from psychological, sexual, of financial nature, neglect, social isolation, entrapment, also forced detention, denial of health care, denial of the right to a family, as Diane Kingston mentioned, forced sterilization, and forced psychiatric treatment. I think one of the unique issues here to address is that abuse happens in a domestic sphere, but it also happens in other areas, such as residential institutions, mental health care facilities. So the domestic violence dialogue has in some ways neglected the experiences of violence that women with disabilities have been victim to. It can be at the hands of family members, but also caretakers. So I wanted to point that out. The other issue that I wanted to also try and highlight is that violence against women and girls with disabilities has been largely ignored by both the disability rights movement as well as the women's rights movement. So women with disabilities, activists with disabilities, trying to address this issue have been confronted with this dilemma of not finding a space to have the dialogue in an effective manner. So one of the other choices that the Technical Advisory Committee made was to work and press the advocacy from the report, from the findings, both within the disability rights movement as well as the women's rights movement. So one of our first points of intervention was at the Committee on the Status of Women. And then we also gathered the good practice holders to carry out more advocacy during the convention, during the Conference of States Parties for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And now we're here today during CEDAW. So I wanted to just give a little bit of context to just try and understand some of the barriers that women with disabilities and girls with disabilities face in accessing justice. One of the findings from the good practices and through our own experiences in the field is that sexual violence often goes unreported for women and girls with disabilities. Victims are reportedly discouraged from approaching the police and other judicial actors and are often forced to settle the matter out of court and out of even informal systems of justice. So, for example, in Indonesia, cases of rape against women with disabilities are rarely brought to court, and when they are, perpetrators get minimum sentencing, and legal and justice systems are highly inaccessible. Sign language interpreters are often not available. The courts themselves are inaccessible. And very often, a person with a disability, man or woman, their testimonies are thrown out and thought of as not credible, particularly for women and girls with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities. The other issue is that both the disability policies and frameworks, as well as gender equity frameworks, often neglect or do not include provisions that specifically mention the rights and needs of women and girls with disabilities. We found this to be the case, for example, in Malawi, where the Disability Act has no special measures that address the rights of women and girls with disabilities. In Haiti, the gender equity policy, as well as domestic violence prevention legislation, do not address women and girls with disabilities. So these are areas within the legal and policy frameworks that really need work. So I want to highlight the importance of intersectionality. I think that this is something we are probably all aware of. There are multiple identities that exist in all movements, and the different layers of discrimination obviously make women and girls with disabilities more vulnerable to violence and to lack of access to justice. We found through the good practices that it was this work from an intersectional approach, cross-movement approach, where women with disabilities worked with women's rights organizations, with gender equity organizations, and with judicial systems. And it was that work together that helped to break down the stereotypes that we have heard about. It helped to dismantle the myths around disability and sexuality that are so harmful. But it also helped to train and to give members of the protection system, of the judicial system, and the women's rights movement more armor to be able to understand how to work with women with disabilities and to prevent and eliminate violence against women and girls with disabilities. And I know I need to end, so I'll just be very brief. In terms of recommendations, I would just encourage the CEDAW committee to have these discussions with states during the review process and to ask, what is the situation for women and girls with disabilities? And to also ask civil society members to bring this up and to address it during the review process. In terms of the Committee on the Status of Women in the Beijing platform, I would echo what Diane Kingston said, to name us, to have greater visibility in the narrative processes, and not to be placed in the other category, but to really be named and have focus and be on the agenda. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Before we pass to the last two speakers, let me just say, what I've heard up to now, I think we clearly have identified the issues affecting girls and and women with disabilities, or many of the issues. And we've also identified jointly some of the measures that need to be taken. We've heard about isolation, invisibility, stereotyping, discrimination, and violence. No? But at the same time, you've been, mentioning the kinds of things that need to be done, both by CEDAW and others. Advocacy and awareness raising is an obvious one. Link with other gender institutions and issues. Create spaces for networking, improve data, certainly improve studies, as the OHCHR was telling us, on some of these specifics, and creating the legal frameworks and the access to justice that is required. What we will now hear is from two women, Fatima Wangare and Priscilla Rodriguez. Fatima Wangare from Kenya and Priscilla Rodriguez from Mexico, both by video and Skype, but they are the ones that are going to pull it together, I think, in a certain way, because they are good practice holders, as it is said here in my script, and I think it's very interesting that we are able to hear from them after having listened to the other speakers. Ms. Wangare will tell us a bit more about how an organization focused on women and girls with disabilities joined up with a mainstream women's rights organization. And by working together, they were able to build the capacity of the justice system to be more inclusive. Very interesting indeed. Ms. Rodriguez will focus on another element of this creating synergies and opening spaces, which is the peer support group for women and girls with psychosocial disabilities, and how they faced violence and were able to work their way through. Very interesting indeed, both of them. And then I will open the floor as much as we can before we come back to the panelists who are here with us, and we want to leave enough space for Patricia for her concluding remarks. So please, Fatima Wangare.
My name is Fatima Wangare. I'm the Executive Director of Kenya Association of Intellectually Handicapped and Academics for those on disability. My organization best practices among the 11
Thank you, Fatima. Let's move to Priscilla Rodriguez, please, by Skype, I understand.
Yes.
Thank you, Fatima. Let's move to Priscilla Rodriguez, please, by Skype, I understand.
Yes. Yes. Hi.
Thank you, Fatima. Let's move to Rodriguez, please, by Skype.
Yes. Yes. Hi.
Thank you, Fatima. Is it working?
Yes.
Is it working?
Yes.
Take your sound off and speak. You are on. Take your sound off and speak.
Can you hear me?
Take your sound off.
Can you hear me?
Take your sound off.
Can you hear me?
Take your sound off.
Hi,
Can you put her now?
Of course. Well, as always, technology, you know, sometimes defeats our best intentions. I know that we are trying, but we will not lose time. And she's there now? Okay, well then, Priscilla, can you hear us and can you go ahead? We have very little time, but we are very interested in what you have to say.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll start. Good afternoon, honorable members of the CEDAW Committee, representatives of member states, and guests. I would like to thank Handicap International and the Technical Advisory Committee for their invitation to present at this important side event, as well as for the publication they are about to release on good practices around the world. This initiative has helped bring together women with and without disabilities who are advocating and fighting for the rights of women with disabilities to be recognized. This initiative has also helped end the isolation, which is many times inherent to this struggle. My name is Priscilla Rodriguez. I am the director for Mexico and Central America for Disability Rights International, and our international organization focused on promoting the right to community integration for persons with disabilities. I'm here to present briefly on two good practices by DRI, which were selected by HI, one in Mexico and one in Guatemala. Our work and findings in both countries reflect the challenges we are facing in the region to end the violence against women with disabilities. I also have the honor of being here on behalf of Dawn from Canada and MAM from Palestine, two organizations that were also selected by HI for its good practices to advance advocacy efforts in favor of women with disabilities. In relation to DRI's work in the region, in both countries, Mexico and Guatemala, we have found a very high rate of abuse against the sexual and reproductive rights of women with disabilities, especially against those detained in institutions. We have also documented very abusive conditions in institutions housing persons with disabilities, including use of isolation rooms and restraints which, according to the UN Rapporteur on Torture, constitute inhuman and degrading treatment and can even amount to torture. We have also documented complete lack of treatment and rehabilitation, but also more severe and grave abuses, including physical abuse, sexual exploitation, among others. What has worked in Mexico to address the violence experienced by women with disabilities has been to empower women with psychosocial disabilities and survivors of abusive psychiatric institutions to become self-advocates that will advocate for their own rights. Specifically, we empowered and trained a group of women within the Colectivo Chucan, the only organization in Mexico run by persons with psychosocial disabilities, to create a women's group that would deal with the violence experienced by women with disabilities on a daily basis. They would the way they work is that they meet every 2 weeks. Only the women, they speak, they talk, and about very strong, very quickly. They are very motivated to advocate for their and other women's rights. And they have become the spokeswomen for women with psychosocial disabilities in Mexico. They've become a truly empowered and independent group. And at the end of last year, together with this group women, we carried out a research in Mexico City to find out more about the rate of forced sterilization and other violations of the sexual and reproductive rights of women with psychosocial disabilities. The women of the Colectivo were involved at all stages of the research, including the designing, the application, the implementation, and they were the ones who also designed and carried out a questionnaire which they later on applied to other women with psychosocial disabilities. This research is the first of its kind to focus on gathering statistics in Mexico on the violence that women with disabilities experience, and the results are extremely alarming. We found that over 40% of the women that were interviewed had been sterilized in a forced or coerced manner. We also, over 40% of the women that took the questionnaire said that when going to a gynecologist, they had experienced some sort of abuse, including sexual abuse and rape. We also found complete and systematic denial of maternal health care rights to women with disabilities who wish to be pregnant. We used, in Guatemala, we used the Inter-American Human Rights System to protect the rights of women with disabilities detained in an extremely abusive psychiatric institution in Guatemala, where we also found some sort of some forms of trafficking of the women detained there. Basically, we asked precautionary measures by the Inter-American Commission, which was granted, and the state was requested to take urgent measures to end the violence experienced by women in this institution. I would also like to mention the good practices by an organization called DAWN in Canada, which has also been doing outstanding work on getting local and national justice systems to address violence against women with disabilities, especially sexual violence. MAM, an organization in Palestine working with Bedouin women in the Negev, has also started including disability in its line of work. Through a case they took of a woman with a disability who got divorced and was going to be deported, they have achieved important policy changes that have impacted all women with and without disabilities. The practices that the HI has compiled show how important it is for disability and women organizations to start addressing violence against women with disabilities, an issue that has been long ignored. This is especially important because of the high rate of abuse experienced by women with disabilities, as already mentioned by Luisa from HI. My specific recommendations to this honorable committee is that they recognize the long-ignored violence against women with disabilities, that they address the systematic violations against the sexual and reproductive rights of women with disabilities in your work. We also respectfully request to include the work of organizations led by women with disabilities, such as the Colectivo, focused on documenting abuses and violations to against women with disabilities. We would also like to encourage you to support the cooperation between mainstream women and disability organizations to include women with disabilities in the fight against violence of women in general. Our goal, which we also hope will become yours, is to, when we talk about women and violence against women, we are also talking about women with disabilities. And lastly, we would like to humbly encourage you to take HS publication on good practices which into account, because it shows the issues women with disabilities are facing today, but also the approaches that will be used to address the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both the reflect and very little time to do so. Two things maybe stuck to my mind, at least, that were suggested by the speakers. One was the question of changing the narrative by women themselves, by women stakeholders. I thought that was a very powerful thought. And then the idea that it is by peer support groups, by joining women again and girls with disabilities, that they can be empowered to become self-advocates. And again, that's a very interesting thought. Let me, before I turn the floor quickly to the floor, let me recognize the presence of the ambassador of Bahamas, Rhoda Jackson, and the ambassador of Brazil, Regina Dunlop. And I also want to acknowledge the presence of Leila Gaber from the CEDAW. And there are other CEDAW members, of course. Yes. So, oh my goodness. There we are. So the recommendations that all of you have given to the CEDAW members are falling in very fertile soil indeed. So let me open the floor. We have no more than 5 minutes, unfortunately, because we do want to give the opportunity to Patricia. Oh no, we do have a little bit more. 10 minutes and you'll take 5? Good, okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Ambassador, for giving me the opportunity of speaking. Very brief remarks, because I'm a little bit afraid that Patricia Schulz won't be having the opportunity while doing a wrap-up to pay a special attention to CEDAW, because she'll try to be fair to everybody. My name is Naila Gab. I'm the Vice Chairperson of CEDAW. I'm from Egypt. Well, I want just to give you the assurances that all articles of CEDAW applies to the situation of women with disabilities. And we have the opportunity of raising questions, but our way of tackling the issue and having the discussion with the countries are based on the reports of the state parties and on the information provided to us from civil society or UN agencies. So I hope that mainly the civil society will be providing us with relevant information, because it will help us raising the question. But nevertheless, we are making use of our articles, starting from Article 2 on non-discrimination, going to Article 16 on family status matters. As the chair of the working group on rural women, and we are discussing now the second reading of the Joint Recommendation on rural women, I can give you the assurances that women with disabilities has been tackled in the GR. And as we are working also and embarking on a new GR as a follow-up of Joint Recommendation on violence against women and gender-based violence against women, I can promise you that after this discussion we have to envisage seriously the issue, and we have to open it not only on the issues of employment, health, and disadvantaged group, but on stereotype. This is an angle we need to reflect upon it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Regina, please.
Thank you, Martha. First of all, my thanks to the organizers. I follow their work. We've been working together with the entities here today, and we are pleased to see how serious and how they are persevering in promoting these discussions and putting these themes discussed here on the agenda here in Geneva. I would also like to thank you, Martha, for leading us through the discussions. And, of course, Patricia Schulz, I'm looking forward to listening to your final remarks. But I would also like, to greet especially Diane Kingston and Harumi Fuentes, of course, and the panelists for their contribution here today to the discussion. It's been said, and just to make what I'm going to say next coherent, that whatever gender differences, make structural violence against persons with disabilities particularly difficult. But when it comes to girls and women with disabilities, this is all more critical. And I think, it deserves our focused attention. And this has received, on the part of the Brazilian authorities, one of the axes within our national plan of policies for women, which is women with disabilities, one of the axes. Of course, the reality of women and girls who live with disabilities, they face greater challenges. And, this reality is not usually taken into account, neither for those involved in making legislation, nor for those, working with implementation of what exists already. So in this sense, and it was one of your comments, Martha, I think what I would mainly put forward is that girls and women with disabilities are called to participate in whatever process that discusses their realities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. John, please.
Thanks, Martha, and let me add my voice of thanks. This event, I think, is terrific from a number of points of view. It brings together two key issues, certainly for us and many of us. Gender and disability are sort of hidden issues, so that's been helpful. It's also, I think, very focused on joining the dots. We don't do that enough in the system, and this is extremely important to connect CEDAW and CRPD. Thirdly, I think it's practical, it's best practice. We don't do enough of this sharing of best practice in the UN, so I think this is a wonderful sort of case study. We're very interested in engaging. We have quite an active program in terms of dealing with violence against women, but also a national disability strategy, and we'd be very pleased to share our experience in trying to join those strategies together, because I think this is part of the challenge that's been discussed today. And you mentioned the Indo-Pacific being a bit undercooked. If we have experience in our region that we can share with you, I think there are a number of countries doing quite creative things, including with new technology in our region. So I guess lastly, the speakers are all very succinct, so I think you win a blue ribbon prize for a great event. Just a couple of comments, additional comments. We've launched in May this year a development assistance strategy with a disability focus, and it's interesting. I was just going through this document before this event, and the figure that was, I think, flagged earlier was 2 to 3 times more likely women and girls with disabilities to suffer abuse. Yeah. If you take that to intellectual disabilities, it's 10 times the prospect of abuse. So I think women and girls with intellectual disabilities are a particular problem we need to focus on. So I'm interested in the panelists' comments on that. And I guess also the question of empowerment. The reference has been made to peer group pressure. A big focus in our development assistance program is actually empowering women's leadership, inclusiveness, getting women and girls with disabilities to engage in the processes. And I think this is something that's very important. Data collection has been flagged. You need evidence to base a policy. So I think the comments made by panelists on that we very strongly support. And also the issue of attitudinal change. The stereotypical challenges are clearly huge. So just in that regard, interested in comments of the panel on new technologies, so we can use social media and technology to really break stereotypes. And the disability community has been a leader in technology and sort of enabling people to engage. Thank you.
Seems to me that we have a second volume in sight for Asia. Yes, Rhoda, please.
Thank you very much, Marta, for organizing and coordinating this event. I found it extremely informative and very helpful. And I just thought I'd place on record, and I'd wish to thank the panelists as well as those who participated by Skype. For the Bahamas, this is a very important issue. We signed on to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in September of 2013. And in September of 2015, just several weeks ago, we deposited our instrument of ratification on the convention, because this is a very important issue in the Bahamas. And one of the things our minister said when she made the announcement was the fact that persons with disabilities tend to be hidden and they're not seen, they're kept away from the public. And what we're trying to do in the Bahamas is to remove the marginalization practices of persons who have disabilities. We've established, or in the process of establishing, a national commission for persons with disabilities, and there's an ongoing initiative with respect to violence against women and the girl child in general. The comment that was made by Fatma Wangari, the fact that it's women first, and I thought that was very important to reiterate, because whether the person has a disability or not, we need to begin to focus on the rights of women as a whole. So thank you very much for this whole opportunity.
Thank you, Rhoda. Sylvia, you have the floor. Can you identify your organization?
Thank you. My name is Silvia Perel-Levin. I represent the International Longevity Center Global Alliance, and I am the chair of the NGO Committee on Aging in Geneva. Thank you very much for this session. As somebody who deals and does research on elder abuse and violence against older women, and after the call of naming it, which I totally agree is important, I feel compelled to us to name women of all ages, and because the intersections refer to older women as well, both women growing with disabilities and also disabilities that come in with age or due to disease, so whether it's Alzheimer or after stroke, or you name it. So I just wanted to call to remember. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Let me now turn to Patricia for her concluding remarks.
Thank you very much. This has been an extraordinary event. I think that the report will be a fantastic instrument, first of all, by the clarity with which it exposes the problems that women and girls with disabilities are exposed to, and the extent, both. Then by the importance of the ground principle, nothing about us without us. And this, I think, is one of the, for me, was really one of the examples of how you can deal with discrimination, with immense problems in an extraordinarily empowering way and competent way. And the process of the making it work has managed to help these women do capacity building for themselves, but also taken the professional groups with which they are confronted and who were very often the perpetrators of the violations to see differently. And this changes the narrative. So this appeal that was made, I think, is by Fatma Wangari is really very important. And reading through the report, I myself really felt that the potential is there, because the report is so practical. The stories are short and you are convinced. You see how solutions can come about. And so giving up the denunciation and going for something that works is, I think, extremely valuable. Then many things have already been mentioned, but I would like to also come to the point of the multiple discrimination, very strongly expressed in the report, the need for alliances between people who deal with disability rights and gender equality, and this convergence, I think, is one of the huge strengths that you have shown. I now try to come to what Diane Kingston said. I think we really are in agreement for the need for mainstreaming the issue in our work. I would just like to mention sometimes the difficulties. Very concretely, there is competition of issues in human rights, and we have little time and little space to address all of the issues. So we sometimes take together in one very compact paragraph the issues of women who are facing very different situations, but they have one unifying point, is that they are exposed to a particularly high risk of violation of their rights. Then to the recommendations that we deal better maybe with accessibility, with inclusive education. This will take on board the data. This is a challenge for many of the issues, and especially I think here. Cross-references, yes, we will. We do it. We have to do it more. I would also like to say how much we depend on civil society organizations to have us made attentive to the situation, because very often we don't get the information in the state report, and we don't necessarily get it either from our sources in the UN system. So we really depend on what comes from you, so that we can competently address the issues that are needed. I have spoken of the empowerment, and I would like to close by saying that I think that one of the greatest privileges of being a CEDAW member is to be exposed to issues that you hadn't dreamt of or nightmared of. And I think that the report has brought it very clearly, and I for myself can, well, I'll speak for me, for myself only, but I'm sure colleagues will join on this. We will address the issues with probably more frequency, and also better address the issue of women with mental or psychosocial disabilities, because they tend to be off our radar. We do address the situation of women with physical difficulties, for instance, lack of gynecological chairs for pregnant women with disabilities, etc. But I really got the message for this group of people, and the fight, the appeal to a common fight against violence for addressed at women, and in particular women with disabilities. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Patricia, for encapsulating so concretely what we heard today, and in particular for getting the message, as you just said, for CEDAW and the CEDAW colleagues who are here. I want to thank International Sign Interpretation, the interpreter who has been with us here, and I also want to thank Handicap International, evidently, for making it work, and the International Disability Alliance with its international campaign on the rights of women and girls with disabilities. So thank you very much to all of you, and have a good afternoon.